We're talking about RIFQA, Mohammed El Kurd's new poetry book. RIFQA is the name of his grandmother. His father told him, "Anger is a luxury that we cannot afford. Be composed, calm, still, laugh when they ask you, smile when they talk, answer them, educate them." Even though the situation that you're in commands anger and so many other emotions.
They're asking him about Hamas, and he's like, "My boy, they're knocking down the door. What are you talking about?"
I wish the earth would split and swallow me. Iraq veteran cites his fear of fireworks. They think they're the only ones with PTSD. We are literate in peeling off our own skin to sleep. I cried, not for the house, but for the memories I could have had inside it.
Palestine has already been one of the innovators of technology while under occupation and siege. So we can only imagine what would have been if not for this nasty militia of Zionist gangs who stole everything.
Hello and welcome to the Palestine Pod, the weekly podcast where we break down the latest headlines dealing with Palestine from all over the world and bring you stories, commentary, and interviews with the aim of supporting the Palestinian struggle for justice and equal rights. I'm one of your hosts, Lara E. You might know me from Instagram as @GazanGirl, and I'm joined by my co-host, Mikey B.
What's up, y'all? Mikey B on TikTok, Michael Schertzer on Instagram, and you can call me Mikey Intifada. If you saw the rally in Poland that had one Palestinian flag and think that that represents all Free Palestine's movement, but everybody chanting death to Arabs in the middle of Jerusalem is okie dokie for you.
The mental gymnastics, it never gets easier.
They do get limber, though.
Maybe they get a little more stretchy. Yeah, you're right. Before we get into today's episode, please like, comment, and subscribe if you hang out with us on YouTube. If you're listening on a podcast app, subscribe and leave a review. And as always, you can find our full episodes and sources on PalestinePod.com. And if you want to get involved in the conversation, reach out to us at PalestinePod@gmail.com and follow us on Instagram @ThePalestinePod. We're also still going strong on Patreon. So if you love the Palestine Pod and you want to support the project, join our Patreon where you get early access to the Palestine Pod episodes and an additional 1 to 2 podcasts per week, including the Patreon Pod, which is a little more laid back. We talk politics, Palestine, pop culture, and you get to know us a little bit better. Feel free to join our Patreon. We are also hosting our monthly Zoom happy hours with Patreon subscribers only. Really exciting stuff. Check us out on patreon.com/PalestinePod. We're talking about this book, RIFQA. It is Mohammed El Kurd's new poetry book. RIFQA is the name of his grandmother, and it is a collection of poems dedicated to his grandmother. They also contain references to her life story with her exile from Haifa to then the family's current dispossession in Sheikh Jarrah, and also recounting some of the events and the emotions of the Nakba and plenty of other stuff. There are things in it that did make me stop and reflect. And so I wanted to go over those. It's interesting. The foreword to the book is Mohammed writing, "As I write this, our family lawyer is attempting to persuade a settler judge to rule against settlements, zebra at the mercy of a jury of hyenas." It really is such an absurd situation. Like, absurdity is the theme that is contained in every poem of the book. They're all about different things, but every single one of them has this element of, isn't this absurd? And there's a couple of themes that I wanted to kind of discuss. He mentions in one of the poems, "This is why we dance," how his father told him, "Anger is a luxury that we cannot afford. Be composed, calm, still, laugh when they ask you, smile when they talk, answer them, educate them." This reminds me of something we've talked about before on the pod, which is the idea of having to be the perfect victim and then having to be, as you are the perfect victim, also, this sort of educator, really composed and eloquent spokesperson for your cause. Like, you can't afford to be angry because everything's already stacked against you. So you have to show that you're not fulfilling that stereotype or that cliche by being, the angry Palestinian or the angry Arab or whatever it is. And that makes me think about the mental toll that it takes to do the work. Anger is a luxury we cannot afford, even though the situation that you're in commands anger and so many other emotions. It's something that, I wrestle with, because part of the debate is, okay, do you talk about what's happening from a distance. You talk about it in terms of human rights violations and the law, and you use words that are neutral to describe really not neutral situations. Or do you get angry? Do you use emotion in your voice? Is that emotion distracting? Is it unprofessional? You have to strike this balance between using your passion and your emotion, but then also like restricting it in a way so that your message is still heard, right, by your audience. And the fact that Mohammed has become really this spokesperson for the cause of Sheikh Jarrah, but even for the cause of Palestine more generally. And his father is telling him, anger is a luxury we cannot afford. Be composed and calm and laugh when they ask you and smile when they talk and answer them and educate them. It just makes me think of the emotional toll that all of that takes on somebody who's living this absurdity, who's living the oppression in real time, but then has to smile for reporters and to, you know, contain himself a little bit and to be restricted and use restraint when he speaks so that he appears palatable, right?
Yeah, I remember when Mohammed El Kurd was doing the media run, and I was thinking to myself, this guy not only has to have been fluent in English, right? Like because he lived in America and went to college here, etc. But he also has to, in the midst of literally being expelled from his house, explain, justify his presence in his own house, in his own land, while a brutal colonizing force is literally beating down the doors outside, like house by house. Like they said house by house. And he has to, in that time, keep his composure, right?
Yeah.
Speak in a language that is not his primary tongue, right? I presume that he learned Arabic first.
Right.
And like also he had to like have a haircut, you know what I mean? He's lined up. Like I've never seen a Palestinian that doesn't look good while advocating for Palestine.
Right.
Everybody understands that the image is a huge part of it, because if you could be discredited in any singular way, right, the Zionists will harp on that opportunity. And they'll do it anyways. They'll do it even if there's nothing, right? They'll make stuff up. They'll plant stuff on you. But I remember thinking to myself, wow, this guy has an insane level of composure, because he has kept his cool when there are guns blazing outside, right? Like it's not safe to be in the neighborhood he's in, and he's on CNN talking about like, do you support the violent displacement of me and my family?
Yes. And then being met with reporters asking him, do you support violence?
They're asking him about Hamas, and he's like, my boy, they're knocking down the door. What are you talking about?
Right. It really is absurd. It really, really is absurd. And in fact,
I also think about Yusuf, right? Joe Gaza, who has to be this like picture perfect messenger for the outside world so that people just get a glimpse of what's happening inside Gaza.
Right. Mohammed actually makes reference to his discussions with reporters in his poetry. There's a poem called Sheikh Jarrah is Burning. And he says, this is the second month of the blockade. Media won't call it illegal. American settlers find their way into the front yard and their billionaires take us to court. Their laws are daggers. Their laws are hungry. Armed colonizers peacock around my street with impunity. And then he goes on later to say, I told an American reporter this is apartheid, but she's not entirely convinced. I look at the cuts she sustained jumping over my neighbor's fence, which is crazy, right? Like he's talking about a conversation he had with a reporter on the ground, like in Sheikh Jarrah. And he's like, yeah, so this is apartheid. And she's like, I'm not sure about that. And next thing you know, she's having to escape probably some tear gas or some shooting or whatever it is, and she gets cut up jumping over a fence. But yeah, let's debate whether or not it's apartheid. It's interesting because one theme that comes up quite a bit is mental health, and he didn't shy away from it. He says in one poem, most days I'm in psychosis, spine to my storms, bait to my rage, tired metaphors. He also says that he won't sit on a recliner and pay $200 an hour to make villains out of coffee stains. So he talks about his resistance there to seeing a therapist. He won't sit on a recliner and pay $200 an hour. But he uses the words. He says, most days I'm in psychosis. He uses those words to describe his mental state. In another poem, he uses very descriptive imagery to describe mental anguish. He says, I wish a snake would swallow me. I wish the earth would split and swallow me. Iraq veteran cites his fear of fireworks. They think they're the only ones with PTSD. We are literate in peeling off our own skin to sleep. We live like walking debris. Like, hold on. We are literate in peeling off our own skin to sleep.
You think that's literal or metaphorical?
I mean, no, of course it's metaphorical, right? But
I don't know. It could be somebody talking about like a burn victim. It's like,
sure, could be. But the idea is he's saying, the white colonizer going to invade another country thinks they're the only ones that have PTSD. And while we're sitting here literate, peeling off our own skin to sleep, we live like walking debris, swallow snakes, swallow whole pharmacies. There's quite a bit in here where he references just how mentally exhausting the work is. And it's something that comes up over and over. And then he at one point says that Zoloft makes his face swell up, a choice between sanity and slimness. So he's also, there's a little comedy in here as well. But it's interesting because it's like, I don't know very many Palestinians that sit here and talk about not only mental health, but also having to like what they're doing, right? What they're doing to actually treat the situation that they're handling. Yeah. How many of us are on medication? How many of us need medication but just can't access it? How many of us are talking to therapists? How many of us need therapists? How many of us have found therapists that are totally not sufficient because we're trying to explain to them the trauma of being in an intergenerational colonial struggle, and it just doesn't land right when your therapist is named, Becky or whatever.
She's like, is it apartheid? Are you sure?
Yeah. Well, that's the thing is like, I have struggled with this a lot because I'm like, I got to find, like finding a good therapist is really like finding it's almost like finding a romantic partner. Like you have to go through a lot till you find the right one. And they're not.
Well, my therapist will not be happy to hear that.
Why?
Just because I think he would want to keep romance and work separate.
Yeah. But my point is you got to find the right fit, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
You got to find the right fit. When you're Palestinian and a lot of your trauma comes from resisting, colonial violence, whether it be physically or psychologically or whatever it may be, then you need to find somebody who understands that. And that's not going to be everybody. But I'm glad that he tackled mental health. I'm glad that he let the world into that part of the struggle.
There's a lot of reference to snakes, right? Yeah. Swallowing things. It's like, you think that that's maybe a biblical reference as well?
I mean, it could be, right? Because he does speak about, in another poem, he speaks about an encounter where he is talking to an employee of G4S. G4S is the company that is a security contractor in the occupied West Bank for the Israeli government. It basically runs like the prisons, the police training centers, the checkpoints. They're active on settlements.
They're heavy users of the secret Facebook for Palestinians.
Yeah, for sure.
They're the ones liking the comments.
Mohammed writes that G4S is complicit in Israel's mass incarceration of Palestinian children. So he writes that many of the 500 to 700 Palestinians who are arrested, detained, and prosecuted by Israel are held in G4S equipped prisons. But he describes an encounter with a G4S like low-level employee, and I don't know where this takes place. In the exchange that takes place between them, he talks about how he's from the land of Christ, and he makes sort of biblical references throughout. So yeah, it could very well be. He also, I'm actually happy we're on this poem because one of the things that he says is that he brings up this issue of, do you really have choice? Do you really have choice in what you're doing? And he's talking about her and he says, what war could she wage when the only wage we know is minimal? What war could she wage when choice left the equation? When voice was robbed from our throats? And, you know, this is, again, something we've talked about on the show before, the idea that so many people end up participating in this machinery of oppression, but that it's not their choice. And first and foremost, I think about like Palestinians building settlements, for example, sometimes very close to the rubble of their destroyed homes. But do they have a choice?
Yeah, it reminds me of the story of the people who are like doctors and lawyers, people who have all types of, you know, civil society jobs, and they're working on Israeli construction sites because that's all that's available to them, right?
Yes.
Their law practice was frozen or destroyed. Their, you know, hospital was bombed, whatever. And so now it's like, well, you work where it's safe. And the place that is unlikely to get destroyed is the new Israeli settlement.
Right. And so then you participate in your oppression, but that's the only thing that in the day-to-day will give you some means of putting food in your family's mouth.
You got to make ends meet. Like, are you going to starve?
It's very twisted. And I can't imagine, again, the psychological impact of having to go to work knowing that you're building a settlement that is going to further cement your ethnic cleansing as a people.
It's very similar to the story of American slavery, right? To the people who were human trafficked into Turtle Island, and then their labor was extracted from them violently because they had no other option. They would be murdered. And I actually just saw a video about a plantation that was running until like 1960.
Wow.
In like the South. Yeah. And the people there who were enslaved, they had no idea about the civil rights movement until like the mass march on Washington, basically.
Wow.
1960. They were still murdering. I mean, they're still murdering people and hanging them from trees in the United States. Right now in California, in Chatsworth, in Los Angeles, they've lynched many people recently.
Yeah, I mean, certainly this oppression does not end, right? If anything, we just don't hear about it, or it changes form, but it doesn't ever cease. So in one of the poems, I thought of you, actually, Michael. It's called "Elderly Woman Falls Asleep on My Shoulder." That's not why I thought of you.
I could see where I would come up.
There's a part where Mohammed and the elderly woman are at a checkpoint, and the soldier at the checkpoint is blonde and sunburnt. And I started laughing because it reminded me of how you've said that before on the pod, that they have skin cancer because they're not supposed to be there. An invader not from the land, blonde and sunburned.
I hope she never has access to aloe. I hope her skin literally peels off.
Right? This is a passage I want to share that is from the poem called RIFQA in the book. And I think it really perfectly describes a sentiment I have as a Palestinian in exile. It's the colonizers, youthful, differently clothed, rifles smacking against their hips, terrorist nation, celebrated stolen property, callous. I cried, not for the house, but for the memories I could have had inside it. That is totally the same sentiment that I found myself having as a Palestinian in exile. And that is that I live in this past that doesn't exist, you know, where I think about what my life would have been like and what memories would I have made, and how things would have been different, and, you know, how my family would have been, right? Would some of the family drama that we've had being in exile, would that never have happened, maybe because we wouldn't have been under certain stressors or pressure? I cried not for the house, but for the memories I could have had inside it. It's something I understand very, very, very well.
I think a lot about alternate histories as well.
Yeah.
There's a couple instances in colonial U.S. history where like just things could have gone a little differently. The election between Truman and his opponent, there was a guy named Henry Wallace, who was the VP to FDR. Henry Wallace wanted basically equality between Black people and white people in like the 40s. He was very progressive for his time. He had some other things, but like by and large, he was one of the more progressive candidates. He cared about healthcare. He wanted to take care of people. And instead, the United States got Harry Truman, who dropped nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki unnecessarily. Right. There's always the lie that like it saved a bunch of lives, but it didn't. That's nonsense. Right. The general himself said that it wasn't necessary. They did it as a means to scare the other colonial powers in the region. Like they just wanted to be seen as reckless and potentially dangerous. And that was their foreign policy strategy. So that's one huge instance, right? That obviously changes the landscape of the entire world, because when they dropped those bombs, it changed everything for pretty much everyone. And then another instance, obviously, is Bernie Sanders, where we could have had him twice. And instead, what we got was Donald Trump and now Joe Biden. And, you know, I'm not saying Bernie Sanders would have changed everything. I don't even really believe in institutional politics, but he certainly would have been better than what we got.
Yeah, it's hard not to think about those things, because at least in the cases that you reference, it's always about an alternative path that would have been better.
Yeah.
Right? That you hope would have been better. You have reason to believe would have been better.
Yeah.
And certainly for me, it's the same. You know, when I imagine being able to grow up in Palestine, I imagine being able to grow up in a free and independent Palestine that received its independence right after the other mandate countries, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and was just Palestine.
Palestine would have the amassed wealth of like a mini Saudi Arabia, if not for the extraction of resources from the Zionist regime. Palestine has already been one of the innovators of technology while under occupation and siege. Right. And so we can only imagine what would have been if not for this nasty militia of Zionist gangs who stole everything and murdered nearly everyone.
Yeah, I think about that when I hear about when my friends in Gaza tell me about how like there's these coding clubs in Gaza, and I'm like, but they barely have electricity. Like, they're like, they do it. Like, you know,
they figured it out.
They figured it out. Like, but that's the thing too. Kids grow up really fast and then they have to deal with adult problems really quickly. And that's another theme that Muhammad's poetry covers. In the same poem, RIFQA, he speaks about his 3-year-old sister, Meha. He says, Meha, 3-year-old sister, cried her innocence, watched the Zionist settlers burn her bed. Yet another Nekba, another divine crime scene. Now Meha is 8. She knows her Nekba isn't the first. She knows she's not the only child whose bed was burned. She knows children are burned. Muhammad Abu Khudair, 16, gasoline. I don't know if you remember that story of Muhammad Abu Khudair.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, who was lit on fire by some settlers. Just really brutal stuff. And, you know, she's 3 years old watching her bed be burned.
Yeah, these are the same people who will tell you about the Holocaust in a moment's notice while they're lighting somebody else on fire.
And then not only is she 3 watching her bed be burned, but then when she's 8, she already understands that her trauma isn't even like unique. Yeah. She knows her Nekba isn't the first. She knows about all the other Nekbas. She knows, oh, this is just part of, what I experience is just part of this bigger Nekba, which, you know, a lot of other people have been affected by. That's a lot for an 8-year-old to know.
8 years old.
And she doesn't know it because, you know, her parents are cruel and just telling her horror stories. She knows it because she's living it. Yeah. She can't not know it.
She doesn't have the privilege to not know it.
Exactly.
Meanwhile, there are people across the world who are like, I don't know enough about it to weigh in. It's like, well, it's been over 70 years. So definitely take your time making your mind.
I literally flipped open to this page. As you said, it's been over 70 years. Take your time. The last line of this poem, called 1948, 1998, is 70 some years later, we haven't lived a day.
The occupation is robbing people of their lives actively, robbing them of their opportunities, robbing you of memories that you could have created, robbing every single individual who encounters it of their time, of their feeling, energy, of their feeling of
physical health, all of it. Like even
Safety.
if you're not being tortured in an Israeli dungeon, like my friend Mohammed El, who is still being held by Israel without charge and whose court date continues to get postponed. It's been postponed yet again. Even if that's not happening to you, best case scenario, you're still having to navigate the physical and psychological effects of occupation, which you cannot escape. 70 some years later, we haven't lived a day. 3 generations of people who have not lived a day.
Meanwhile, you've got, the colonizer on TikTok making dances with guns and using your awards. Music, eating your food, and claiming it as their own.
And then getting awarded by the army, the colonial army, for improving Israel's image.
Really, really makes you commend the mental strength of Palestinians who have not snapped and just went like fully loose cannon.
Yeah, because everybody would in the same situation. Like, why does the world expect of us what they would never accept for themselves? I always say that about Palestine, is people expect Palestinians to be some sort of like superhuman, able to tolerate and accept and navigate circumstances that nobody in the first world would ever accept for 5 minutes. Look how people act when they have to wait in line. Look how people act when there's traffic. Look how people act when, something isn't going their way, or when the waiter comes back and says, "Oh, sorry, we're out of this." People have meltdowns every day in the first world about nothing.
Bagels, can I speak to your manager type situations?
Yeah.
Every Palestinian is expected to be a UN peace negotiator, a lawyer, a doctor, a therapist. You know what I mean? All in one.
Yeah, to have patience for 70 years.
And if they don't, you're so emotional. You know what I mean? You've got like, just take the emotion out of your voice. And it's like, well, people have been being murdered for 70 plus years. So the fact that there's emotion in my voice is regular.
It's regular.
The fact that there wouldn't, if anybody who doesn't have emotion in their voice talking about this is kind of weird.
Yeah.
Right? If you can talk about this from a sanitized perspective, you are weird.
You're weird. You got problems.
Don't talk to me like a newscaster voice about, children being murdered. Don't do that.
Yeah. I remember during, I think it was 2014, during Israel's assaults on Gaza, I was in Paris and I got into my elevator and there was a French lady in the elevator, and she looked at me, and she started complaining about how slow the elevator was going. And she was like really upset. She was irked. She could see, this elevator, I'm going to be late. It's so slow. It just gets slower every day. We have to do something about it. And I was like, yeah, I agree. And I'm just sitting there like the words that are coming out of my mouth and then the scenes in my brain are just like, they're not matching. Yeah. Because I'm sitting here thinking about Gaza and I'm just like, yes, this elevator is really slow.
There are people who will harness the type of energy that could be useful for liberation struggle, and they will just use it on mundane, unnecessary things, right? Because it's easier. It's easier to do that. It's easier to be like, let me talk to the manager of Jamba Juice versus like, let me talk to the CEO of oppression, right? Like it's harder to do that.
For sure. Or they will take on like really, I want to call it like fake activism, but just like activism that is not controversial. Like bullying, online bullying. Like nobody is pro bullying. Everybody agrees that
you didn't meet my bully. He was very pro bully.
It's like, like the first lady initiatives. Move your body. Michelle Obama. What was her thing? Like
get up a garden.
Get up and move.
Yeah.
It's not controversial.
How terrible is it that that's where America's at, where the first lady is not asking you for exercise? She's just like, hey, just move a little bit.
Oh, yeah, let's move. It was called Let's Move. Like you see what I mean though, right? It's not, you're not, what do you nobody's saying don't move.
Some people are anti-movement. So
nobody's saying don't move.
Hey, you know who hates movements? Intelligence agencies.
Yeah.
The CIA, very anti-movement. They didn't like the Black Power movement.
So it's like, okay, fine. She probably put a lot of energy into that, but then also like,
yeah, Melania Trump came out against online bullying, which is funny.
She was the online bully initiative. Yeah. And it's like, okay, nobody's pro online bullying. We all know that.
But her husband was bullying people online all the time. It was a delish little mashup.
That's true. So maybe that one was more controversial. I don't know. But
it's like that's the only way she's willing to talk to him is like, hey, I'm just gonna put out some tweets to let you know what you should be doing.
It's all on your point of like people using their energy for like non-issues or fake issues or
yeah. And then sometimes when people have things that are going well for them, they have to create issues in their lives because they thrive on conflict in their own life. They thrive on like tension in their relationships. And so they create these fictitious things because they don't experience real oppression.
Like the elevator lady.
Yeah. They've never actually stood at a checkpoint and had their time stolen from them. So they're like, you know what? This elevator isn't fast enough. And it's like, ma'am, shut up. Respectfully, shut the fuck up.
Yeah. And I mean, again, it marked me. Like, I will never forget her. I will never forget that in exchange, right? Let me share one more thing that I marked up from Mohammed's book. So he writes a poem about the incident that took place on July 16, 2014, when Israel kills 4 boys in Gaza, aged between 9 and 14, while they were playing soccer on a beach. They were literally targeted by Israeli airstrikes while they were visibly playing soccer on the beach in Gaza. It was a bad PR moment for the apartheid state. They had to do a lot of clean up in the aftermath to try to justify why they did it. And then in some instances, you saw their spokespersons going on in interviews being like, we are deeply sorry. It was like a mixed bag of all sorts of bullshit. One of the things that he writes, which resonates, he writes, here we know 2 suns, Earth's friend and white phosphorus. Because in Gaza, it was documented and established that Israel was using white phosphorus on Palestinians during their military assaults. And if you don't know about the effects of white phosphorus on the skin, you can look it up. He also says, here we know 2 things, death and the few breaths before it. This reminds me of something like that I saw in relation to Syria. It was like an image of a boy. And he says, in Syria, we know we have 6 daily prayers, not 5. We have the 5 plus the funeral prayer, because as to say that every day there's a funeral. So every day they're going to the funeral prayer. You know, in Gaza, one thing that I got from my family during May was this idea that like everybody was ready to die. Everybody was ready to die. People talked about it all the time. People were like, that's, you know, we're ready to go. Like, we're ready to die. Not because they wanted to die. They didn't want to die. But when you have this massive amount of weaponry that is being dropped on your home and on your city and on your neighborhood, and seconds separating one bomb or one drone from the next, you have to wrestle with that and you have to sort of make up your mind about it. And it's something I heard from, you know, my brother-in-law's family. It's something I heard from friends there. Everybody was ready to die and everybody was saying it. And so when Mohammed writes, here we know 2 things, death and a few breaths before it, it also captures very much that idea, which I have heard from friends and family in Gaza, that death is all around them and everything else they're living is just like the few minutes before it.
And it reminds me of what he said in an earlier poem where he wishes the earth would open up and swallow him. It also reminds me of the Iranian scientist who survived assassination, right? When asked about seeing the car and his fallen comrades, he said, I envy them, because he has to wake up every day and live his reality. At a certain point, death becomes a reprieve from life. Like you said, the human being is dignified, and to be robbed of dignity in such a way, death becomes a reprieve from living that life.
Look, I mean, the book was a real pleasure to read. I'm going to read it again because I'm sure there's so much I missed the first time around. There's a lot in here. Everybody pick up a copy. RIFQA is the book. It'll give you stuff to think about.
And Mohammed El Kurd is currently on a book tour across the United States. He's going to various colleges, SJPs, holding events, book signings. Make sure you check out his schedule. He might have some upcoming events near you. Go and support him.
Yes. B'Tselem has published a new report in November 2021 about Israel's misappropriation of Palestinian land in the occupied West Bank through settler violence. The really interesting thing about this report is that it basically connects the state's theft of Palestinian land to the settler violence that is taking place against Palestinians. And it shows how these two things are related and work in concert with one another and are not separate and distinct phenomenon. I just want to cover this a little bit because I think it's really interesting to see how the state not only turns a blind eye to settler violence, but is actively using settler violence as a means to solidify its own land theft of Palestinian land. So it's actually a means for the state to continue to steal Palestinian land. So just to summarize the situation as it stands, Israel has built more than 280 settlements in the occupied West Bank. Those 280 settlements are home to more than 440,000 Jewish settlers. Of these settlements, only around 135 of them were officially established and recognized by Israel. That makes around 150 of them not officially recognized by the state. So
that's a lot.
Yeah, I know.
You telling me these popped up without the recognition and nothing's happening? Meanwhile, they're managing to demolish Bedouin villages in like the Jordan Valley. So, if I had a business and more than half of it was off the books, I'd go to jail.
Yeah, for sure. So basically, the settlements dominate and take over hundreds of thousands of dunams of Palestinian land. As a result, Palestinians end up having limited or no access to that land. We talked about this, I think, in last week's episode, the ways in which Israel steals Palestinian land. One of the ways that it does this is that it issues military orders. It declares the area state land. It declares the area a firing zone. It declares the area a nature reserve, and then it just takes the land for the state. That being said, in parallel, other areas of land are just taken over by settlers through daily acts of violence, including attacks on Palestinians and their property. So the report goes on to say, while the two tracks appear unrelated, the one track being the state...
To who? Fucking Stevie Wonder? What are you talking about?
Well, no, but hold on. I mean, you could say that, okay, on the one hand, settlers are doing their own thing, trying to take land for themselves. And the state is also doing its own thing, using the law to take land for the state. B'Tselem report basically says that this is not true. There is, in fact, only one track, and that is that settler violence against Palestinians serves as a major informal tool at the hands of the state to take over more and more Palestinian land in the occupied West Bank. The state fully supports and assists these acts of violence, and its agents sometimes participate in them directly. As such, settler violence is a form of government policy aided and abetted by official state authorities and with their active participation. This is really important. When we read about settler violence, oftentimes it is presented in the media as being like this sort of like rogue phenomenon. Oh, it's not all Israelis. Oh, that's just, it's one bad apple. It's one, it's just one settler. It's not the state itself. It's not the ideology behind the state. But in fact, it is all of those things. That's what the B'Tselem report is showing us. It's showing us that the state itself is actively supporting settler violence, benefiting from settler violence, using settler violence to solidify further land theft of Palestinian land. The report goes on to say that settler violence has been documented since the very early days of the occupation in countless reports, books, testimonials, etc. This consistent documentation has had almost no effect on settler violence against Palestinians, which has become part and parcel of life under occupation in the West Bank. Settler violence.
Yeah, those fucking psychos are like, hey, can you send me the video for my Instagram?
Yeah, seriously. The report speaks of how these violent acts include beating, throwing stones, issuing threats, torching fields, destroying Palestinian trees and crops, stealing crops, using live fire, damaging homes and cars, and in rare cases, homicide. In recent years, settlers in so-called farms...
In rare cases?
Yeah.
In rare cases?
Yeah, they don't provide a number. But anyways.
Are they talking about steak? What the fuck?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. The Beit Salem report says that in recent cases, settlers have been violently chasing Palestinian farmers and shepherds away from their field and from pasture land and water sources that they have used for generations. We covered a story like that a few weeks ago, I think. Now, here's where the state gets involved. So the military avoids confronting violent settlers as a matter of policy. Again, we've heard of anecdotal situations where there's a scenario of settler violence against Palestinians in the occupied West Bank, and then, soldiers are there and they don't get involved. But what the Beit Salem report is doing is that it confirms that this is a matter of policy. This is not just one soldier who didn't get involved and who didn't protect Palestinians. This is a policy matter.
Yeah, remember when the settlers attacked the army?
Yeah.
The settlers attacked the army and the army was like, it's no big deal. Just a couple of tear gas canisters. That'll take care of it.
Yeah. So the military avoids confronting violent settlers as a matter of policy. And although soldiers have the authority and duty to detain and arrest settlers, they do not. As a rule, the military prefers to remove Palestinians from their own farmland rather than confront the settlers, using various tactics such as issuing closed military zone orders that apply to Palestinians only, or firing tear gas, stun grenades, rubber bullets, and even live rounds. Sometimes soldiers actively participate in the settler attacks or look on from the sidelines. So basically, the policy is this. Settler violence takes place. The soldiers, instead of protecting the Palestinians from the settler violence, use violence on Palestinians or declare the area a closed military area, and then basically effectuate the land theft in that way. They use the settler violence as a pretext to say, oh, well, we're just going to eliminate the violence by taking over this land.
Yeah, remember when they declared that playground a military area?
Right.
Like structures of oppression that exist in concert with the state and work together with the law. This exists as a parallel in the United States as well, right? The Ku Klux Klan existed as the longer arm of the law. White supremacy was upheld not only through the police, but through the extracurricular fucking terrorization of Black people by the Ku Klux Klan.
Right.
And it continues to this day. You see how the judge in the Kyle Rittenhouse case is basically, concerned about like the emotional state of this dude, pouring crocodile tears. He's talking about how you can't pinch to zoom in on an image because he thinks that would be unfair. And it's just like one of the things that the iPad allows. He's clearly got a vested interest in the outcome of the case. And it's because this white child used state colonial violence to suppress a Black power movement.
We're going to post a link to the report. The report presents 5 different case studies that illustrate how continuous systemic violence carried out by settlers is a part of Israel's official policy and how it drives massive takeover of Palestinian farmland. There's a bunch of testimonies. It will really make you think differently the next time you read a story about settler violence, because although it rarely is reported on in the mainstream media, if it ever is reported on, it's reported on as a sort of unique event, a singular event, a one-time thing. And this report really challenges and rebuts that notion completely, showing it for what it is. It's one of the tools of ethnic cleansing that is part of official state policy.
Yeah, it's how it came into existence. The idea that anybody could be like, oh, it's isolated. You have to have amnesia to be like, oh yeah, this is brand new. I've never
the whole state was born out of settler violence.
Ethnic cleansing.
The whole state is settler violence. Yeah.
That's the story of the occupation.
That's how they got there.
Not a brand new story. It's at this point, it's kind of old.
It's an old story, but yeah, definitely a report worth checking out.
Folks, that has been another episode of the Palestine Pod. Thank you all so much for listening. Please go check out our sources at www.palestinepod.com. Follow us on Instagram at the Palestine Pod. Send us an email at palestinepod@gmail.com. And please check us out on Patreon at www.patreon.com/PalestinePod. That's been another episode of the Palestine Pod. Thank you so much. Have a great day.